Um, so first of all, for those of you who are attendees, you are hopefully able to hear us and see us. We can't see you, but I want to point out to you a couple of the features that you have access to. If you look at this nice little slide that Zoom Video provided, and this is in no way a sales pitch for Zoom, but we're using their software. For most of you, down at the center bottom of your screen, you'll see three features: a chat button, and a raise hand button, and a Q&A button. And we want to encourage you to use the chat button and the Q&A button today during our program. The chat button, we want to encourage you to use if you have any technical difficulties. And if you're having trouble with your video or your audio, or you're not hearing us properly, if you have questions of a technical nature, we encourage you to send a chat to Jim Perry or to all of us as panelists. And you should have that feature with your chat button if you click on that. As we get into the program, we'll ask each of our 5 panelists to provide some opening remarks. And then about halfway through, we will open the program to questions and answers. So for anyone who would like to submit a question, the way to do that is to open the Q&A button on the lower part of your screen bar and type in your question and send it to us. And Nancy will be filtering those questions. And once we're done with our presentations, our presenters will be able to respond to those questions, and we'll have hopefully a good discussion going through the course of the program. Nancy, is there anything that I missed regarding housekeeping?
Yeah, folks, just if we can remind you to please not use the raise hand function. We're not prepared to deal with that with a group this size, but go ahead and put your questions in the Q&A and we'll bring them forward to our panelists.
Okay. All right, thank you. So this topic is one that I'm quite certain that everyone on this program today has been thinking about. And like the rest of the world, we're just beginning to wrestle with the second and third order implications that are coming from this health crisis and economic crisis that's being driven by the coronavirus pandemic. We are clearly in a transformative world period. There are not a lot of things that most Americans can agree on today, but I'm going to guess that today most Americans could agree on the fact that we are witnessing and experiencing a shock to our systems and our institutions and our way of life that's probably more profound than any of us have ever experienced in our lifetimes. I think that we could probably get most Americans today to also agree that what comes after this, the kind of society, the kind of economy, the kind of social structures that emerge from the coronavirus pandemic are probably going to look very different in many ways relative to our life today or our life last month. Will we be entering the new dark ages? Will we be entering an economic depression? Or will there be positive opportunities in this crisis? And will life in a few years look more like the new Renaissance? There is a huge range of possible futures in front of us, and no one is certain about what those will look like. But I've seen speakers and writers, and I noted a couple of quotes that struck me in the last couple of weeks. One is a gentleman named Eric Kleinenberg, who said on a podcast that the next months and years of American life will be as explosive and as consequential as anything we have ever lived through before. The writer Naomi Klein recently wrote that during periods like this of cataclysmic change, the previously unthinkable suddenly becomes reality. And with those kind of possibilities in mind, we wanted to open the discussion and look at those questions from a lens of our work in conservation. And so for most of us, what this means for our work battling climate change, our work to protect clean water, to preserve and conserve habitat for wildlife and working lands, we know that all of those efforts will be affected to some degree by what's happening today. And our guests today are way too smart to think that they know the answers to those questions. But they are thought leaders in the world of conservation, and what we're inviting them to do is share with us their thoughts, their experience, and their questions as they look at the world of conservation from 5 very different viewpoints. So I'm going to address and, introduce our 5 speakers, and then we'll ask them all to share some thoughts with us. Bob Martini is a founding member of Wisconsin's Green Fire and serves on our board of directors, and is an active member of our water resources group. Bob worked for 32 years with Wisconsin DNR as the statewide river protection coordinator. And for those of you who were in Wisconsin at that time, Bob really led the state's efforts in implementing the Clean Water Act responsibilities to clean up the Wisconsin River and help drive a successful program of environmental conservation that is still a model today. Jennifer Gigrich is the Government Affairs Director at Wisconsin Conservation Voters, where she's worked since 2007. Jen works in the Capitol and at the federal, state, and local levels on conservation policy. She works with legislators and their staff and with agency staff, and is one of the most active, effective, and well-respected people working in the Capitol today. Dr. Tim Van Dielen is professor in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology, and he's the Beers Bascom Professor in Conservation at the UW-Madison, where he's been since 2004. Tim has worked as a scientist for the Illinois Natural History Survey and with Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. And his work bridges the gap between researchers and conservation agencies. He's studied black bears, wolves, deer, badgers, sandhill cranes, turkeys, flying squirrels, and is known to his students and his friends as a thoughtful, wide-ranging conservationist. Dr. Jonathan Gilbert is director of the Biological Services Program for the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, where he has worked since 1984. John served in the Peace Corps in the Fiji Islands and the Ivory Coast. He's a longstanding member of the conservation community in Wisconsin, well known to many of us, and he's also been an active member of Green Fire's Wildlife Work Group. He's also the steward of 19 sled dogs, and if we're lucky today, we might get to meet one of them. And finally, George Meyer, who has worked in conservation in Wisconsin for over 40 years. George was inducted in 2017 into the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame, and we're proud that he's also a founding member of Wisconsin's Green Fire. George served 32 years at DNR, including service as secretary from 1993 to 2001. He's taught conservation and environmental policy. He has a law background, and he has served as Wisconsin Wildlife Federation Executive Director since 2003. So we want to thank all 5 of you for taking time to be with us today. And we're interested in hearing your thoughts, and we're also very interested in hearing the discussion with all of us that will follow. So with that, Bob Martini, you're the one member of our panelists who attendees can't see today, but you have the floor, and we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Thank you. I think observations in the midst of a crisis are not always going to yield great wisdom, but nevertheless, I have some observations from my home in northern Wisconsin. Number one, I think it's likely that the public is turning to science in this crisis as opposed to a political system for making decisions. Polls show that the public has a lot more faith in science now than it had in the past, largely because of a failure of a political system to ward off this crisis. I think there's a emerging feeling that the political system is broken, and you might trust science a lot more than they have in the past. I think we'll also see an ascendancy of health as a driver of the environmental protection system. Most of our environmental protection system evolved early on as a health protection system, resulting from typhoid fever outbreaks and air pollution, health-related issues. But lately, say within 1910 to 1918 in Wisconsin, a lot of the environmental protection system has been driven by economic myths or political philosophy instead of health in terms of developing policy alternatives. But health, I think, is a real driver, and it can be worldwide. World Health Organization estimates 7 million deaths per year due to air pollution. In India and China, there have been major demonstrations against the pollution in their countries. But during this pandemic, India alone has seen a 71% drop in the kind of particulates that cause health problems in air pollution, a 70% drop in nitrogen oxides, all due to the shutdown of industry. The China industrial shutdown for 1 week is estimated to be equivalent to Ohio's pollution for a full year. When people experience these improvements in air pollution, I think it's going to be hard for them to go back to the polluted system that they were used to, and there'll be a lot of push to try to make sure that they don't regress driving that political system. I think one of the things we'll see in Wisconsin is there won't be any money left for major environmental or education systems. A lot of the federal money and state money is going to be tied up in debt service. We're seeing post-World War II type debt and a major reduction in the revenue to pay it off. So it's going to be hard to do things with big bucks. I think we're going to have to concentrate on changing behavior and changing thinking in large populations instead of relying on large dollar increases in programs. We're going to see unforeseen consequences. We've already seen some of this. The economy is driving all sorts of problems we didn't think we had. When restaurants and others shut down, there wasn't demand for cheese, therefore no demand for milk, therefore milk dumping, which could in turn drastically impact water quality. These are the kinds of things that are going to be popping up in the future as unforeseen consequences. Well, there might be some conclusions. Maybe they're wrong, but I think that we'll see that although COVID-19 outbreak is really bad, it's causing suffering all over the world, it's actually a temporary thing compared to climate change. Climate change has the potential for greater misery worldwide, and it's long-term, and it's less reversible than a virus outbreak. We're also seeing that people can adapt. They're working at home in a matter of weeks in ways we never thought possible before. I think in the past we've seen that disasters have resulted in some of the most important steps forward in our society. World War II, for instance, the development of the United Nations. The Great Depression, we had a safety net that resulted from that, Social Security and other things. The Cuyahoga River on fire and the Silent Spring resulted in a whole series of laws like the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, and NEPA that helped protect the environment. The Dust Bowl in the 30s made a significant change in how we manage soil in this country. Maybe the COVID-19 outbreak and the shutdowns could result in some steps forward. Maybe some important things could change. Maybe there'll be more support and trust in science. Trust in science has been dropping in recent years, but this is the kind of emergency that could improve it. Maybe we'll see a new water protection system in Wisconsin, a more comprehensive system that takes care of some of the disadvantages of the piecemeal approach we've had for the last 10 years. Maybe there'll be a better voting system that reflects what the public really thinks and desires. Maybe people will buy less, waste less, and change how they live. There might be a possibility to take advantage of lower pollution, especially lower air pollution due to shutdowns, to calibrate our climate models. We're seeing a major reduction in air pollution resulting from worldwide shutdowns. We should use that to try to see how the environment reacts and try to make sure that that data is available to climate change modelers to verify and calibrate the models. People are spending a lot more time with their family and thinking about what really matters now during the shutdown. Maybe that'll change how they feel about protecting the environment and the future. I think a lot of people are really thinking about the difference between truth and fiction. Facts matter more now than they did before the shutdown, it seems to me, in terms of people's reactions. So those are just some of the things I'm thinking about in my little wooded home in northern Wisconsin. And I think that the world, all around the world, people are thinking about some of the same things. I think bottom line here, people are talking about uncharted territory, but I don't really think it is uncharted territory. The 1918 flu was bigger, 675,000 deaths in a population of 100 million. That's much larger than we've seen or are projected to see in our country. I think climate change is the real uncharted territory. It has greater potential for human suffering worldwide. It's more long-term, and it's less reversible. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Bob. And for our attendees, again, as you develop questions, feel free at any time to open the Q&A button and submit them. And we'll start to get to as many as we can after we wrap up. Jennifer.
Great, thank you. So when I was thinking about this question, I was really focused on how is government going to balance all these complex choices that they're making right now, and what are the lessons they're going to learn? So both from a program perspective and policy perspective, but then also politically. And I think that's really important because, you know, as Bob was alluding to, climate change is kind of the big picture question out there that a lot of us are concerned about, but also water conservation, water use, emerging issues like PFAS. We're going to need to understand what decision makers are taking from this and what voters are taking from this. So I was kind of thinking of it in three different levels, like concentric circles of impact. So the first being, you know, the immediate policy environment, what resources, what other demands are on people's time and attention. The second, what do policymakers learn from this whole experience, and what is that going to mean for their likelihood to take on big challenges like climate change? And then the third one is just really big picture, like how's our society in which all our conservation decisions get made, how is that going to change, and what are the trends that we might see? So taking that first one, you know, what's the immediate impact? You know, Bob alluded to it. There is going to be not very many resources at the local, state, or federal level for issues. And it also is taking a lot of the attention of all agencies, all decision makers on that. But that could play out in different ways. So one of the things that I am hopeful for is that long-range planning and preventative policy solutions become the things that decision makers want to put their money in, that there's the best bang for buck in not having to deal with a problem. So all those pandemic response plans that were developed and then shelved, that's the kind of thing that I'm thinking decision makers might be more attentive to. So groundwater models, flooding models where we fill in wetlands, climate change models, maybe that becomes a better driver for limited funds. One thing I am concerned about though is that with limited funds, people become very focused on putting out immediate fires. And we know that when it comes to conservation, the immediate problem is very rarely helpful for dealing with why that problem was occurring. So making sure that we don't fall into this very immediate or get trapped in kind of partisan fights about whose money or whose program we're going to spend when there's limited dollars. On the next level out is looking at what are some of the political lessons that decision makers might take from COVID-19 responses. And I think it's just fascinating when you look at the country, there are very different ways that governors have responded to the same threat. So some of them took immediate action. They made very tough decisions on the front end to try to prevent, massive public health problems. And that had a huge effect on their economy and, the culture of their area in the immediate. Some governors decided, you know what, I don't see an immediate threat. I want my people to be able to golf and go to church, and I want the economy, I want the beaches open. And when this is all said and done, and part of this will be, what actually happens with death rates and mortality rates and all that, and what happens with the economy long term, but who gets rewarded? Is it the people who were visionary and took tough actions and asked for big sacrifices from everybody up front and thus prevented a bigger problem, which is what we need for climate change? Or are the people who the economy ruled, they were cautious, they kind of held back maybe in a positive light of this, of seeing how it all played out before they jumped in? It's going to be really interesting to see. And some of that we won't know until how it plays out, but then also in the storytelling of what happened, what are the lessons that we're going to learn from that? And then finally, I think just, zooming out to the bigger picture of our society, this all happened almost immediately. To me, it feels like it's kind of like the September 10th versus September 11th. It was a completely different sea change. And so we didn't have time to prepare anything. Nobody made any conscious decisions about, okay, we're going to go this way for policy. So a lot of the data that's going to be collected out of this time, I think we kind of have to be thoughtful about the fact that some very real human impacts happened because of that. And that as we're thinking about advancing policy, that it wasn't that we went from, a fossil fuel based economy where everybody drives their car to, COVID-19, everybody stay at home, and carbon emissions dropped. Carbon emissions dropped because people weren't going to work, because, we weren't having a society that was up and functioning. It's not like we all of a sudden overnight went to all clean energy solutions. So I think thinking about we need to collect the data. So I think that's really important, but then understanding that only gets us so much, and that we still have to paint this vision, and that needs to be there. But I'm hopeful that because that was able to happen, there are some positive things, some very great innovation and entrepreneurship. You look at GM being able to switch from making cars to making ventilators. That's the kind of, entrepreneurship we're going to need to kind of get to some of these really technical, hard problems that our society is facing. So I think that seeing that we can do that and do it quickly is exciting, and that. On the flip side of that, I think we just are going to have to remember as conservationists, when the immediate is over and we are going back to wanting safe drinking water policy and climate change policy, that there is a really huge human impact to all this. And so I think thinking through how our policies can be human focused, and that the impacts of this were not across the board. And a lot of times when it comes to pollution, when it comes to lack of resources, or where things get cited, the impacts of our pollution is not uniformly across the board either. And so being really mindful of how inequality across the board impacts conservation as well, and making sure we're taking that forward. So those are just kind of the three levels of thoughts that I had about this.
Thank you, Jen. This is going to be a great discussion. I see it coming already. Dr. Van Deelen.
Right, it's just Tim, thanks. I guess what has really impressed me, and probably is what got me invited to this webinar in the first place, is I really was interested in the fact that policymakers were trying to sell the public on a dynamic mathematical model. These are the sorts of things that we deal with in wildlife science all the time. And so I got to think about, you know, flattening the curve enters the lexicon. And you had people all around the world studying a dynamic curve fitting model. You had the University, I think, of Washington that put out a model that you could, with sliders, you could change some of the assumptions and you could see that curve move up and down. And I got to thinking about, you know, that is a really powerful tool for explaining to people the nature of some of the conservation, the complex conservation issues that we face. So climate change is one of the ones I've been thinking about, but being a deer nerd, I am also thinking about things like chronic wasting disease and other wildlife diseases. And I'm going to share my screen here with you a minute. I hope this is not too unforgivably of an egghead thing to do, but I reproduced that epidemiological curve that you always see. So the red line there was the curve that we're always trying to flatten when we talk about changing our behavior. And we often talk about the fact that on the left side of that red curve, where the number of cases, either infected individuals or deaths, is increasing, that's an exponential increase, and it really isn't. There's an underlying exponential process there, but what you have is positive feedbacks like the exponential process fighting against negative feedbacks. And it strikes me that this is kind of the nut of many of the environmental problems that we're working with. So if I just walk you through this, if you look at the red curve, on the ascendant part, on the left part, as it's reaching the peak, there you've got a dynamic that's mostly dominated by the positive feedbacks. But once you get to the top, then the negative feedbacks take over, and the negative feedbacks win, and that takes you down the other side. So the positive feedbacks in an epidemiological model is that underlying exponential process. 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and so forth. But it's not strictly exponential, because at the same time, in the simple epidemiological models, you're running out of a pool of individuals that can become infected. The susceptibles are draining away. And when you lose enough susceptibles, then the growth rate gets over the hump and starts turning negative again. And the dynamic is governed by a negative feedback. What's the negative feedback? Well, the infected individuals are either becoming recovered and remaining in the population, or they're dying. And the green line there is the population level influence. So if I've got total population on an x-axis all the way over at the right, the green dotted line is kind of a hypothetical for what we hope is the case for a viral disease like COVID-19. In other words, the population size is not much different after the epidemic than it is during the epidemic. But that's only because we expect that people are going to become immune, or that somebody's going to invent a vaccine, or that there's some public health change in behavior that reduces the rate at which individuals can become infected in the first place. But in the wildlife world, you know, in the case of chronic wasting disease, that new equilibrium would be all the way down at the bottom. And it's not because individuals are recovering, it's because the bats in this case have died off. And so that gets me wondering about, for instance, chronic wasting disease. For chronic wasting disease, if you're thinking about negative feedbacks, for white-tailed deer, for chronic wasting disease, there's no recovery. So the thing that's feeding back is the fact that the population itself is dying. They're probably more like white nose syndrome. And I've struggled with explaining why I think chronic wasting disease is such a difficult issue in wildlife management. And you know, you run up against these ideas that are out there that, oh, they'll find a cure or they'll find a vaccine. And I think if you're thinking kind of disciplined about this, you have to wonder about how realistic that really is. So, you know, these are the sorts of things. It's a little more abstract for something like climate change, but in climate change, we accumulate effects. We accumulate damage to ecosystems. So we accumulate ecosystem dysfunction. We accumulate species extinctions. There's no recovery from a species extinction. So it's a little like white nose syndrome in that sense. So all these things, chronic wasting disease, COVID-19, climate change, my hunch is that they all have that same sort of shape. The only difference is that the time scale is much shorter for COVID-19 than it is for a problem like climate change. I think the other lesson for this is that the payoff for addressing these things early, so the sense of urgency that we had in the pandemic, I think that rewards you in kind of two ways. Number one, it reduces the curve, but I think it also, over time, because you learn to deal with it, right? In the case of a pandemic, it probably reduces the area under the curve, which would be the sum total of all the individuals that become infected, or in a climate change model, it would be the sum total of the damage that you incur. So walking people through that, I think, is interesting, because all of this intense interest right now in flattening the curve has people thinking in terms of how do we change the dynamic? That question of how we change the dynamic. And I think if you took them a step further and talked about positive feedbacks, negative feedbacks, and what the new equilibrium condition would be as a result of those feedbacks, it gives you a new tool for maybe explaining why chronic wasting disease is the problem it is, and why it's so difficult to deal with something like climate change, and why it's the bang for your buck in addressing these problems earlier pays off down the road. So I don't know, I'm hopeful here in the sense of having this be an opportunity to renew or rejuvenate the education we're trying to do on how to address some of these problems. I think that the fact that we're all sitting at home and we're doing this meeting remotely suggests that there is some hope that you can get people to collectively change their behavior for the common good. And part of that, I think, is explaining to them both the urgency and the way the system is behaving. I think there's hope in that. I'm not a policy person, so I'm going to defer to the policy people who are on the panel here, but I do think that there's a natural experiment going on that Jennifer was talking about, where you've got different approaches to managing the disease. We've got an experiment happening where different governors, different states, we're going to get to learn something about how good government can address a difficult public policy problem that's got all these complex dimensions. So I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't even play one on Zoom, just a population guy, but those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. And I will give you your screen back.
Thank you, Tim. Yeah, really helpful. And I'm curious, when we get into the discussion, what conversations you're having with your students about those same topics. John Gilbert.
Unmute. There we go.
There you go.
So, thanks, Fred. Yeah, very interesting conversation so far. I'm looking forward to the questions afterwards. Many of you on this Zoom call know me and know what I do for a living. And, working for the Ojibwe people and trying to infuse culture into my science is kind of an honor for me. But it provides me with different perspectives. And so maybe I want to offer one of those different perspectives today for the purpose of this conversation. And so as we've dealt with COVID-19 coronavirus in Indian country, this has been expressed mostly as an issue of food sovereignty. And some of us perhaps have seen in grocery stores where food is becoming scarce and all, but that's only really a very small part of this issue from the tribe's perspective. And so I want to, as my Ojibwe friends have taught me, the best way to explain things is through storytelling. Maybe I'll tell you a short little story, if I may. I need to preface this by saying that I am not Anishinaabe. I'm not an Ojibwe person. They call me Zaganash. And so I'm just a Zaganash from New York. But I have worked for the Ojibwe tribes for 35 plus years or so. And so I've gotten to know them pretty well. And so I'm hoping that I can tell the story in a way that's accurate. If I get anything wrong, and if I offend anybody, apologize in advance. So the story goes something like this. There was a time back in the day when the animals could talk to each other. And this pitiful being called Anishinaabe, people, humans, Homo sapiens, came into this world with these animals. And the animals looked around at this pitiful being and saw that it couldn't fend for itself. It didn't grow fur to stay warm, didn't know how to build a house, didn't know how to do any of those things to keep itself in this world. And so the animals got together and they talked amongst each other. And they said, they decided that they would come to the aid of these pitiful beings, humans. And they would provide for them. They would provide food, they would provide shelter, they would provide clothing, but more, they would provide a spiritual connection to the natural world. And the story goes that the animals and the people entered into what they called the original treaty, right? Everybody knows that I work for treaty rights and try to implement treaties for the tribes. But this is the original treaty between the animals and the people. And the treaty went, the animals will provide for the people in those various ways that I mentioned. And in exchange, the animals would want respect and honor from the people. And if the people respected and honored these animals, the animals would stand up and provide for the people. And so when we think about this story, and kind of our present circumstance, let me read something to you that was provided to me by one of our traditional ecological knowledge specialists. He says, the Ojibwe have long understood that ignoring natural law can have serious consequences. Traditionally harvested foods are favored for ceremonies in order to convey respect for the natural law and because people believe that these are medicines. There is a belief that foodborne pain detract from our goal of connecting spiritually. Industrialized nations charged with the responsibility to provide food for millions of people have placed profits and efficiency ahead of the dignity of and respect for animals slaughtered to feed us. Okay, and so we can see how that perspective then can play out in this coronavirus situation. I mean, we've heard stories about kind of the origin of this disease, how it's come from markets where animals were held in abysmal conditions. And perhaps it's not surprising from an Ojibwe perspective that this disease actually has emerged. How does this affect us today, in the immediate? So this springtime is a time for spearing walleyes, right? Tribes are getting ready, the walleyes are spawning, they're coming into shallow areas of the northern Wisconsin lakes. Tribes go out to fish for those walleyes by spearing them in the springtime. It's a highly efficient way to fish, and this attracts lots of people to the boat landings and onto the lakes. And so how do we put together the need for social distancing and for taking care of each other by staying apart and reducing the transmission of this virus? How do we put that together with this congregation of fishermen going out on these lakes to provide food for their families? So this has literally taken many, many hours of my days in the past couple of weeks to deal with this. And the tribes have said that the exercise of their rights in the effort to secure healthy food is, what do we call it? An essential activity. It is one of those essential activities that just like police or first responders or grocery stores or other pharmacies. These are essential activities. Well, tribes going out to fish for these walleye is an essential activity. And so how do I now deal with this exercise of the right, this essential activity, and I'm responsible for monitoring the harvest, having Creel clerks at the boat landings, our law enforcement are there to make sure the rules are followed. So how do we conduct ourselves in a way that is safe and responsible? And so these things are coming together for me, this idea of food sovereignty and food safety, along with the rules on social distancing and all, coming together in a very real sense for my day-to-day job. The tribes are really, really interested in incorporating these natural foods, these traditionally harvested foods, into their diets. And so, you know, going out fishing for walleye, bringing it home, filleting it up, frying, that's fine. But what about school lunch programs? Or what about their elderly feeding programs? Can we use these traditionally harvested foods in a way to provide for our elders and our children and these various food programs, knowing that these foods are far healthier than the foods they're getting now from government surplus programs and such? And that the Ojibwe belief is that these foods are medicines that will help them to overcome diseases and, you know, like diabetes and such that are so rampant in Indian country. So, you know, as Fred says that we were so smart to answer these questions, I have to say that I was smart enough to know I did not know how to answer these questions, that's for sure. So I began to think about it from this tribal perspective, and that's where this whole notion of food sovereignty came from, and I started to try to put those things together. But I am a scientist too. That's the other half of my job, right? And so I've kind of thought about this issue from a science perspective also. And I have to say that I will disagree with Bob Martini on his statement. So science and scientists have been vilified, or at least marginalized, over the past years. And I think it really got really bad in Wisconsin in 2010. And this marginalization has been manifest in many areas, right? We've seen climate scientists doubted. We've seen Wisconsin deer management biologists and scientists taken off of that job and given to non-professional hunters. And now we've seen this dismissal of science in this disease outbreak, and it's caused the situation that we're in right now. We have seen advice by scientists dismissed by the general public, while the opinions of the opinionated are seen as valuable. And the erosion of faith of our science-based community leads us to unwelcome consequences and outcomes. And this can be clearly seen with the novel coronavirus. And it can be seen also in Wisconsin deer management system and the whole issue with climate science. Dismissal of science is leading us to problems. I have no solution for this, and I'm sorry. You know, I don't know how to solve this problem. The only thing that I can do, I think, is to participate in calls like this, perhaps, but also to raise my kids in a way that they understand what science is all about and respect the work that I do as a scientist. In the final analysis, that's the best that I can do. The other thing I'll say about science and this issue with coronavirus is that science does not work at the speed of policy. Okay, it takes time to test hypotheses. It takes years to do that work. And pandemic outbreaks happen quickly, and it's way too late for science to gear up to answer those policy questions that, you know, their various political leaders may have. The solution to this one is to be proactive, to think of situations, to test hypotheses, to come up with novel ideas on how to approach diseases like this, and to think kind of in advance. It will never be the case where a policy person says, I need the science to back me up, and then the science is there the next day. That just does not happen that way. And this mismatch in kind of the time frame between the way scientists do their work and the way politicians and policy people need their answers, there's a significant mismatch there. And I think that is poorly understood. So there's my little 5 minutes. I don't know if it took 5 minutes, 5-minute talk, trying to bring both kind of an Ojibwe perspective and a science perspective to this question. And that is my role. So miigwech.
Thank you, John.
That means I'm done.
Thank you for the story and for painting the picture for us of Ojibwe life today. George.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. And I hope that you are all doing well. Your families are doing well. This is a very stressful, tough time for many people. I'd especially like to thank any of you or your families or friends that are engaged in serving and protecting the public on the front lines these days. Talk about people that are in stress. They really are, and their families. I'd like to thank Green Fire for putting this on. This was a very proactive effort by them to get people thinking about the future. This is my second call of this nature today, and I think it shows in both our nonprofit conservation world that we are trying to look ahead and seeing what's in the future and what we need to do in the short term to ensure we have strong long-term outcomes. When Fred called to ask if I would want to be on here, I readily agreed. I just hope he wasn't calling because he thought I had lived through the last great pandemic. But it is a time we can learn from that crisis. We can learn from other crises like 9/11, Pearl Harbor, and what has to be done. There are similarities, even though the causes of the disturbance are different. Last weekend, I spent a day with our executive committee, the Wildlife Federation, and our staff, doing planning for the rest of this year and for the rest of next year. And then starting to think beyond that. But the more immediate situation, until hopefully we have a vaccine to deal with this disease so that we can get closer to normal. We will never be where we were in 2019. The world has changed and will continue to change. Some bad, some good. Obviously, the health aspects, short term, are very bad. I'm going to talk about this in terms of two scientists. You've had excellent scientists on this already. You've had some very good policy people that I truly respect along everybody that's on this panel. But first I'll talk a little bit about hard science, and then I'll talk about the social science aspect of it. From the hard science aspect, and this will agree a little bit with Bob and a little bit with John, but at least my take on the role of science and whether it has been changed. Let me just start off by giving my perception, but I think it's one that the polls show is the great majority of citizens of this country agree with. The two most influential people in the United States today are Dr. Deborah Birx and Dr. Anthony Fauci. The people of this country, and I think there was a poll done where they were up around 80% of people having confidence in them. If you've gone through the agony of seeing some of these daily presentations by the president and collected staff, you probably have observed the situation where Tony Fauci, after hearing what the president says, jumps up to the mic and gives a straight answer. People have understood he's the person to listen to. And in fact, they are well respected for a couple of reasons. One, just outstanding careers and their interactions with all the top scientists in the world for a long period of time. And the thing that they have conveyed, I think you'd all agree, is the rigors of science. And when they're talking about some potential, or the president has pushed the therapeutic treatment of a couple of drugs that have not been tested as therapeutic for this disease. Fauci always gets up there and explains why this experiment can go on, but it is an experiment, and there is not proof yet that in fact it is effective. And he's talked about the testing process that has to go forward. That is a great educational effort for the country's citizens. The other thing, thing they are, which I think is very instructive to us, is they're excellent communicators. Talking about some very tough concepts to explain, but doing it in a way that it has sunk in with a lot of people in this country. And it shows that you can explain these things in a way, and you have to explain them to, in fact, get people to have confidence in them. So the downside for any agency or those in the private or non-profit sector that deal with science have to understand that's a double-edged sword, because the science that they have brought forward in their explanations has also instructed the public on the rigors of science. So as we present science in our jobs, or the government does, people will be skeptical to check in that whether they have the same rigors of what they've seen presented to us over the last couple of months. So that is a double-edged sword, and a good double-edged sword, really. Let's talk about the social science. And one of the questions laid out is, will the coronavirus scramble or realign the current intense polarity in our politics? I'm going to divide that into a national and state level. I think it may do some scrambling on the national level. And I say that because I think people have, and Jen talked about, they've seen good leadership in Andrew Cuomo versus the President of the United States, different styles. And between the two, polling's been done that more people have confidence in the Cuomo approach. And you've seen bipartisan. The governor of Ohio has done an outstanding job. So, I mean, there have been governor of Massachusetts, another Republican. And people have seen what leadership is. There is, I believe, feeling that people have a feeling that we need to get behind individuals that show that kind of leadership and respect for public health and applying and listening to science. But there are barriers on any level. There are barriers constrained on how far we'll go. The election of November will determine a lot, and that will give the public a chance to express this, what I believe, change in that election. But there are constraints even beyond that. You deal with the Electoral College. You deal with the how the senators are selected. Every state having two, which doesn't reflect the population effectively. So there are constraints on how far it can go. But I think you will see that, provided we can have, it's a big question, a good election. And people are able to vote in the middle of maybe another wave of this disease. On the state level, it's tougher. This is a highly gerrymandered state. And I think we saw this week the extent to which a political party will go to prevent losing power. And they have the levers of power. We've seen that in the courts. We've seen that in terms of the control that they've had over the legislature and their willingness to use the court system and any other mechanism to, in fact, keep the existing system in place, which has not been pro-science and has not reflected the public will of the majority of citizens of the state. So things are much more difficult. A census, if it can be taken effectively, a redistricting taking place, probably by a court, that will be more favorable to a balance. So I think there can be change, but it's going to be much more difficult on a state level. Just addressing some of the social science, Jen, I think, talked about it. The economics of this is not going to be good. There's going to be a lot of people lose their jobs permanently as a result of this, and a lot of small businesses will recover. There's going to be some more nonprofits that won't recover from this. The finances are going to be extremely difficult, both in the private sector and the governmental sector. Our debt is skyrocketing. On a state level, you're going to see major funds going to take care of unemployment, programs for low-income people that are already stressed are going to be in far difficult condition and needing support, proper support. So in fact, there will not be a lot of money, discretionary money, that will be spent on some of the things we would probably want. And we're going to have to make what we're looking for realistic and effective in terms of dealing with the needs of a group of people that have gone through a very difficult time, both physically but also psychologically. And surely, I think our work product, the concentration of our resources, can be that one of those solutions to this. But we're going to have to be very realistic on how we do it. I think you're seeing innovation in business, and I think that's a good thing. We'll lose some businesses, but they may be businesses that may be having adverse effect on the environment in an disproportionate way. And hopefully we can, the businesses, there'll be new businesses come in place that when they start, they'll just start out with a cleaner slate in terms of emissions or their attitude towards protection of the environment. There's going to be one interesting is the innovation we've seen in the medical area and how things are being stepped up and moved through government regulation quickly to get tested. That's good for us in terms of public health if it's done right. But you're going to see stress put on. Let's get rid of some of the government regulation too. We may well see again. We have to make sure that government regulations that are slowing us down from positive outcomes are streamlined, but also that the outcomes are and the methods and the impact is probably assessed and will not cause harm. But I think there could be an advantage to some of what we're seeing in terms of streamlining some of these approval processes, especially in the medical area. Social norms. People will tend to go back to a lot in terms of how they lived before, except for those things that they could see were having a dramatic impact on them and their families in terms of potential adverse health and death. So I think you're going to see more social distancing. I think people are going to be looking at how they can be protective of each other beyond this. Probably going to see people washing their hands more often. And in fact, we'll have to take into account how people interact, having conferences like this rather than meetings. And I think that has benefits terms of transportation emissions. So I think there's a lot of positive things we can learn about how we can do things without coming together in a room someplace. So with that, those are some of the thoughts I have. I'd be glad to join in with everybody else in answering questions. Take care.
Thank you, George. Well, as we promised, a really wide range of perspectives and observations, and I think it all paints a picture for us of how complex and challenging the next few years are going to be. One observation that came to mind for me as I listened to several of you, we're all thinking about what is the public trust in science, and how does that change as a result of this? And it's striking how, when a hurricane's coming, the weather forecaster is the most important person in the room. And we find a way to trust them and make decisions based on what they tell us. And yet the climatologist is sometimes the person with the similar skill set who's thinking in a longer time frame. And we find it people find it harder to take faith in the same type of observation. And so there does seem to be an urgency to which we trust science, and sometimes we're not willing to do that with issues like CWD or climate change. And I think we're all going to be attuned to whether and how that changes. I think we've got some great questions. So Nancy, we'll turn it over to you.
So we have a wonderfully engaged audience, and I'm sorry you can't all have your microphones activated so that we could have a bigger conversation, but that's tough with a group our size. We heard a lot of really interesting ideas and reflections from our panel members, and of course we're getting a lot of interesting comments from our broader audience. So I'd like to paraphrase a few of them. I would say very few are direct, easy questions. They're more bigger issues to ponder upon. So what I'd like to do is then ask our panelists to ponder on the concepts and issues in these comments and reflect upon them and share your thoughts. Not to put you on the spot, just whoever would like to make some additional comments, but I'd like to share these with the entire group. So I'm going to start, of course we have a lot of comments about climate change and the reflections on climate change that we've heard from our panelists. So I'll start with a question or a comment about, do you think the shift in public trust in science around coronavirus can be translated to climate change once we're back to normal life? Of course, climate change is less tangible and front and center for a lot of us than a global pandemic. And if we think we can make that connection, how can we best draw the lessons between our experience now with the epidemic and climate change? Any thoughts, panelists?
I think that it would be really likely that the public is carrying a different opinion of science forward than they had 2 weeks ago or a month ago. But the transfer to climate change won't be automatic. I think you've got a fertile seed bed there, but you're going to have to water it and put seeds and fertilizer in it to get it to bear fruit. The idea, I think, is for all people who are concerned about climate change to try to reinforce that concept continually, point out that it was really science that is helping us deal with this epidemic, not politics, not myths, not personal opinion, not philosophy. That science really matters, and it's really important to keep hammering that message forward, because the public, I think, is susceptible to that message now, but it's not automatic.
So I think my take on it is a little bit like science in itself, just as an entity, I don't think will have any more bearing on our lives post-COVID-19 than it did before. I think what COVID-19 really highlighted as far as the connection with science, and if people are listening to it, and it's kind of similar to what Fred was alluding, if there is an obvious thing in your life that you are dealing with and somebody can explain it to you and explain how you become safe and are no longer a threat, they become relevant. And it's not because they're a scientist, it's because they are solving your problem in a way you understand. So the interesting thing about Dr. Fauci, I mean, I watch all his, not all of them, but I watch a lot of his press conferences with Trump because I'm a political nerd. But actually, the best response he has gotten is that he has gone completely, there was a great article in Vanity Fair by Liz Smith, who is the campaign director for Pete Buttigieg. And she said he had been amazing because he went anywhere that they would have him. And so one of his biggest audiences, he did a live thing with Stephen Curry to get young African-American or young people of color who are most susceptible in communities to talk about why social distancing was important. He went to them and told them in their language, in their forum, with their trusted resource. And I think if we are going to be relevant on climate change when this is over, it's not about science, but it is about being very intentional about how people experience it and going where they experiencing it and being open to all kinds of people who can be messengers for us on that.
Just to extend that idea, I love the idea of going out, having scientists go out and speak to groups and do that kind of education. In the case of climate science or climate crisis, we're not really waiting for a scientific magic bullet here. There isn't one on the horizon. And I think that's a message that we have to talk about as well. I do think that the fact that this flattening the curve business has entered the lexicon and that everybody is talking about it and looking at these curves, even the President of the United States is pointing to them, gives us an opening here to make some analogies to other problems like chronic wasting disease, like climate change. You know, in the case of climate change, for instance, if you would say, well, you know, the analogy to the COVID-19 experience is that we wealthy Westerners with our huge carbon footprints, we're the equivalent of the people who are hoarding the toilet paper. And suddenly you've got a message that resonates with anybody and they can trace back and see whether they believe the analogy or not. But it gives us a new language and a new way to teach, I think.
You know,
I would just add that I too agree with Jennifer that getting out to talk to people and being able to talk our lingo, but in a way that is understandable to non-scientists is critically important. And being able to do that in all kinds of different forums, that is really an important thing also. But, you know, the coronavirus issue, it hit us really hard. It's an immediate issue. It's right in front of people. And as Jennifer said, we have competent medical experts that are there explaining things and helping us kind of get through this thing. Bringing that to climate change is very different though, because in many ways, if we wait till climate change smacks us up against the wall and, you know, starts doing really, really bad things, it's almost too late at that point. And the other part of that is us Westerners, you know, rich countries, we can deal with these climate change impacts. When you start talking about third world impacts and, you know, those people do not have the same wherewithal as us to adapt and to kind of get through it, right? And so while we're waiting here for this climate change stuff to get us, all of those people are suffering and it's really too late for them. And so I'm not sure that I see the exact same parallels between the coronavirus, which is immediate, which is worldwide, which is right now, and it's killing us, versus climate change, which is more diffuse. The effects are more variable across the world, and the ability of people to deal with it differs across the world. So it's a little bit of apples and oranges, I think, in that way.
We have a lot of comments about climate change, so I just want to add a couple other wrinkles to the concept here. One of our comments is about the fact that coronavirus is creating an immediate problem, requiring us to respond quickly. How does the panel think about how we might try to increase public interest in longer term questions like climate change when the threats are so far in the future?
So I guess I don't have a good answer, but here's what I'd say. I think that we need to do a better job of identifying people who are trusted messengers who do have impact. So in the state of Wisconsin, farmers are seeing this. People who actually public health officials in Milwaukee the COVID data is showing us that places where there's more air pollution, people had harder times resisting the effects of COVID-19 when they got it. So I just think that we need to do a better job of putting people front and center who are being impacted. Because I agree with John, it's not like if we wait till we have a COVID-19 level of urgency on climate change, it will be too late. But I would say we're at least at a flu level, level of impacts, and we should be able to talk about that and deal with that. So I just think we have to be more creative about getting those people out there and talking from their own perspective about the impacts.
This is an interesting one. We've talked a lot about Dr. Fauci, and there's a comment that we should remember that the government has had to provide Dr. Fauci with bodyguards because his science has led to shutting down the economy, which, to put it mildly, has angered people to the extent that his life is threatened.
Well, that's
I
today's
think
really.
anybody who has brought a message to an audience that they don't want to hear has endured those same kinds of threats, and scientists throughout the centuries have been vilified and treated this way. But I think the ultimate triumph is whether or not the data was correctly predicting what would happen, and eventually society is better off for their proclamations, even if the short-term response is anger and threats and that sort of thing. That sort of thing's been going on forever, and it's part of the process as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, but I agree with Bob. I mean, some of our employees, myself personally, whether it was in a treaty rights situation or for those that go way back, posse comitatus, and I think maybe even worse to some extent today. But there will be risks to this, no question. And we have to protect the truth tellers. But I think it's, is that bothering Dr. Fauci? No, he's been in tougher situations dealing with Ebola in Africa. So I think it does come with the turf.
And to offer another side of what we're experiencing socially, it seems to me that this is one of the only times in most of our memory that everyone in society has been asked to make a sacrifice. And for the most part, there's relatively broad agreement that we need to do this. And I don't know if a month ago anyone could have predicted that actually most people are on board that this is a really tough medicine we have to take right now. Maybe there's a degree of social solidarity that comes with that creates benefits for us later.
This comment kind of picks up on that topic here, a comment that people are already feeling and believing the impacts of our changing climate in Wisconsin, from farming, flooding, parasites, tourism, and the economy. So it's not just in the future, and this is a highly teachable moment.
I agree with that. I think that was a point that I was trying to make, is that you've got everybody focused on these models again, and you can use the same models to show that activity, prevention, addressing the problem early has outsize impacts down the road. In other words, you're trading off time for damage and effort that it takes to fix it. And I think, if you made the comparison between the United States and South Korea, you would see that immediately. I get Jonathan's point completely about the fact that it's essentially invisible when the effects are accumulating so slowly. The x-axis, that curve I drew, is much different for climate change than it is for COVID-19, but I think the dynamic is similar enough that it gives you a language to try and communicate the science again. Whoever said it among the panel here that this is a teachable moment, I completely agree with that.
I think it's also important to use stories, though. I think Jonathan is correct in saying the stories teach as well. And I think if you can combine the stories with the science, it's really important. If you've got people explaining what has changed in their own personal life, in their own experience from climate change, and add to that the documentation from the science side, it gains power.
Here's another comment.
Yes, I have to
I'm sorry.
I have to agree with Bob on that. I mean, he mentioned my name, so I have to agree with him. Storytelling is a very powerful tool, and listening to Ojibwe people tell stories, it's pretty amazing how they do that. And they can tailor the same story, they can tailor it for the audience and impart a different message to that audience depending on what they want to teach them, and with the same story. And it's really quite amazing to hear that once you hear these stories over and over again. And so, yeah, I agree. Storytelling is a very powerful tool, and scientists would be well served to learn that skill.
Here's another question comment. The New York Times had an article today about new research which links air pollution to coronavirus death rates. How do we develop and collect this sort of information and utilize it to provide information to the public and decision makers as we as a society prepare for such future events?
I'll just offer an observation as a non-scientist that one thing that's really impressed me in the last month is seeing the really rapid collaborative effort among the science community to study, analyze, crunch data, and present it in a way that is hopefully useful to policymakers. And you see research teams across the globe collaborating on studies of immunization and vaccines and other things like that wouldn't have been possible a decade ago. I find that to be very hopeful.
If I can bring up a side issue to that, you referred to the New York Times article. The major newspapers, whether it's USA Today, Washington Post, New York Times, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, there have been some really excellent journalism going on. Obviously, dealing with the political side of this, but also the scientific side. And one of the concerns I have is, the fallout of this pandemic is really stressing journalism right now too, in newspapers. The loss of income from advertising or whatever, and that may continue in a diminished amount. But the Fourth Estate has played really an important role of getting communications out to the general public, and they should be recognized for that, and hopefully people still buy newspapers.
I think that, the question was these observations that perhaps this disease is more significant in areas where there is increased air pollution. These kinds of things are, and the question was, how do we do more of that? We got lots and lots of smart people thinking about this. And I have no doubt that over time, more and more of these kinds of observations will be thought about and will be tested. right? So the first step in scientific method is to make observations about what's going on around us, and then to develop hypotheses about those observations. And give it time, you know, science works slowly. That's what I was trying to say before. Science works slowly, and there are lots of smart people thinking about this, and I have absolutely no doubt that there will be all kinds of studies done looking at various effects of this disease. I mean, it's all been in the news recently about the disproportionate effect on people of color with this disease. That's another aspect to this. And more of these kinds of observations, I'm sure, will come out as we go through time. There's lots of smart people thinking about it.
One of the advantages of the whole scientific system is that there's pure science and there's applied science. You don't have to do a 4-year study to answer a question. You can consult with hundreds of researchers who have looked at a piece of that question and use a professional judgment approach to try to determine what's likely to happen and then study it after the fact. So there are many people all over Wisconsin that have been collecting particulate data, for instance, for air pollution for decades. And there are many people in the Division of Health who have translated that particulate data into health outcomes. And there are many medical professionals who can take those health outcomes and relate them to the current virus outbreak. So even though the studies aren't being done, the 4-year study done to answer a question, that scientific process can be engaged to answer those questions right now with existing data, not necessarily to the 100% level, but certainly enough to make policy decisions that are required week to week or day to day.
Here's a really interesting idea to reflect upon. I'm not sure we've got a good answer for it, but just something to think about and maybe comment on. A comment here: what if people currently skeptical about the magnitude of the COVID-19 threat look back on the pandemic in the future as being overhyped? Sorry about that. And then what might that mean for how these same people later reflect on climate change science?
So I will be honest, that is my big fear. And I think the reality is, if the people who are really aggressive are successful in flattening the curve, we won't actually know that it was all that stuff. Or people who are not inclined to believe it aren't going to believe that they were saved because everybody stayed home. So part of what I think is really important and is part of this lessons learned, there's actually like, what does the data tell us? What are the differences that we compare between areas? But then what's the story we tell after the fact? And so I think it's going to be really important for public health advocates and conservation advocates and good government advocates to talk about in real ways that having this aggressive shared sacrifice did result in better things. And here's how we know that, and not be complacent about that. I think we're too often complacent against that economic argument. And I think for this type of thing, especially when we're successful, they'll never believe it because it never happened. And that was the point.
If I could just add what Jen said, on social media, I've communicated with people that are saying that already. But I think there is data out there developing, and Tim can maybe amplify this, that shows those countries that are slow to do the interventions that had to be done are having worse results. So, and I think those that have done an excellent job or found a workaround by more testing, as example, have been hit less. The country to look forward to on this is Great Britain. They came to the show later than everybody else, and what some of the epidemiologists are saying, they're going to be maybe a show place. They don't want to use that word, but show worse results than most other countries, clearly European countries. So I think there'll be data out there that we can use to combat what obviously will be raised by a portion of the deniers of science.
I think you use that data in addition to the information that says, what are you out if you do these precautions? So in the case of epidemiology, stockpiling materials, making people understand how viruses are transmitted, keeping general health better, getting people health care, all those things are good in and of themselves, and they also contribute to stopping a pandemic. The same thing is true with climate change. There are a whole series of things that can be done to prevent climate change that are also good for the economy and good for a whole series of other things in society. So even if they don't believe that the ultimate goal is achieved, there are benefits to all of these practices that prevent climate change problems, even in and of themselves. They prevent health problems from air pollution, for example. Agriculture can benefit from some of these changes, and a whole host of others. National Academy of Sciences had 13 separate actions that could be taken worldwide that would actually be either economics neutral or would provide profit. So I think in addition to showing that there are some end results like climate change prevention that are important, getting to those results can also serve the needs of society.
Thank you, Bob. And I think this is a good point for us to wrap up, although it's clear that if we were just able to open a beer, we could keep this conversation going for another hour at least.
Say, Fred, could I make one more? I just have to
Yes.
read one more of these comments, which is, I think, a nice wrap up for us. That we had lots and lots of really interesting comments that we didn't get to, but one I would love to share with you is, in the end, scientists will prevail and people will recognize their value in relation to lives saved.
That is a really good point of closure. And Bob, I'm imagining the cartoon where the group of people sitting around the board table and someone says, well, what if we make the world a better place and it turns out that climate change is a hoax after all? And guess what? We still have clean water and renewable energy and clean air.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think it's clear that the world is changing really rapidly and is going to continue to do that. And our businesses, our farms, our working lands, our institutions are all going through some dramatic changes. And we are going to have to be smarter than ever to roll with that reality and work within the changes that we're experiencing and still try to move the ball, which in some ways is more important now than ever around conservation and around climate change and the issues that all of us care about. So I think for us, this conversation is only a continuation of work that most of us have done throughout our careers. And we want to thank all of you for participating today. John and Tim and George and Jennifer and Bob, thanks for your wisdom. For all of our attendees, we want to thank you for staying tuned today, providing good questions, and we will be sending you a follow-up message with an opportunity to give us feedback about these programs and what you liked about today and what you'd like to see in the future. If you'd like to know more about Wisconsin's Green Fire, I would simply encourage you to check out our website or follow up with any of us, and we would let you know more about the work that we do in clean water and wildlife, forestry, fisheries, air, and a variety of other programs that Wisconsin's Green Fire and our volunteer members continue to make their work. So with that, again, thank all of you for taking time to explore some uncertain ground with us, and we will look forward to the next conversation.
And we have 3 more April webinars scheduled, so please look at our schedule and sign up for additional webinars if you're interested.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. Stay healthy and stay safe.
Yep, thank you.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.